let's get started with our academic panel on constitutions and democracy. I'm going to turn things over to our session moderator, Nathan Schneider, who is a journalist and an assistant professor of media studies at the University of Colorado Boulder, where he leads the Media Enterprise Design Lab. Nathan's current project is an exploration of models for democratic ownership and governance for online platforms and protocols. Nice to see you all. I'll turn it over to you, Nathan.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for being here all. Thank you, Kristen, for guiding us through this whole process. It's just been a fantastic event, and you've been so helpful all along the way. Today, we're going to focus on the kind of intersection of what we know or think we know about political, social governance systems from before DAOs began allegedly taking over the world, and what we can apply from those lessons, from that experience, from that knowledge to this wild emerging world of DAOs. The title of this session focuses on two key terms that you actually don't often hear in DAO land: constitutions and democracy, but which arguably are kind of floating in the background. These really important kind of elephants in the room are these concepts that are familiar to us from political systems, really relevant in the context of DAOs, or is something new and importantly different going on? To explore these kinds of questions, we have two really fantastic speakers who I will guide us through a bit of a moderated conversation and an open conversation as well. First, Primavera De Filippi, who is a researcher at CNRS and the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard. I think I've first encountered Primavera's work when she gave an early talk about Ethereum, subtitled Freenet or Skynet, at Harvard, which was, to my memory at least, the first time I heard an academic conversation about this thing I was just starting to get obsessed with after reading the Ethereum white paper at the beginning of 2014. And since then, Primavera has written a book, Blockchain and the Law, and lots of fantastic articles that I've cited many times, and has been a tremendous leader in this work. Andrew B. Hall is a political science professor at Stanford and the author most recently of Who Wants to Run? How the Devaluing of Political Office Drives Polarization, and also author of many articles that I've really enjoyed exploring and have taught me a lot about the current state of US politics, and might explain in some ways why people are running to DAOs these days. So I want to start with the question, maybe to each of you, of what your guiding metaphor is when you think about DAOs. Of course, you can't one-to-one import everything from, pre-DAO context to understand this world, but what do you think is the most useful metaphor for thinking about what a DAO is? Are they more like countries or cities or clubs or companies? Is there a metaphor that you use in your mind to even begin to think about what we're dealing with? Maybe start with Primavera and then go over to Andy.
Yeah, so I will answer the question more seriously, perhaps immediately after I actually answer with my own metaphor, which might be less serious, but actually maybe not. There is actually a metaphor that I use oftentimes with DAO, which is a blockchain-based life form. And the reason is because it is actually something that lives on the blockchain, that is to some extent autonomous, that does not depend on any specific entity or single operator. It is self-sufficient in the sense that it is capable of collecting the resources that it needs in order to operate and survive. And it is also possible, it is capable of reproducing itself either by spinning off new DAOs or just simply by forking itself into other instances. So that's the least serious one, but I think it's actually nonetheless an interesting metaphor. And then to answer the question more precisely, I guess the question is more like, is it something that is more akin to a country, a city, or like a public entity, as opposed to a club or a company, which is more of a private entity? And I think it's interesting to actually understand, like, why do we care about that? And it's mostly about like governance. Like, is it more, does it represent characteristic of public governance, or does it have characteristic of private governance? And I think that the first intuition will be, of course, that it is more private, because public governance is really about when you have people that find each other in a particular place or geographical location, and therefore are subject to a particular type of governance, as opposed to private governance, which is where people voluntarily decide to join and associate to a particular entity. And in the case of blockchain and DAOs, there is obviously this private element to this. At the same time, there is, like, when we talk, especially when we talk to blockchain more so than DAOs, there is this public and permissionless and openness, which means that there is those boundaries that usually exist when we talk about a private entity are not so clear. People can get in and out very easily. And so in that sense, there is like the transparency and the openness that is more characteristic of public governance structures. But this is something that I think applies mostly to blockchains, public and permission blockchain, as opposed to private and permissioned ones. And so I think if I need to answer your question, I will say that DAOs, I think oftentimes I will say that they are closer to this private thing, because DAOs are actually, they have like rules about how do you get in and how do you get out and things like this. But DAOs actually live on top of that blockchain, and that blockchain might actually be more like a country or like a city. So we have like companies and clubs in a countries or in a municipality, and then we have DAOs that lives on top of a public and permissionless blockchain.
Great distinctions between life and institutions, between some of the different layers we're dealing with here. Andy, what are your metaphors?
Sure, yeah. I'll keep this brief, because I think Primavera already covered a lot of it. I think for me, first of all, the definition I particularly like, just because it makes it super practical and clear to me of what a DAO is that it's a group chat with a shared bank account. And I think when you start to think about, well, how does that group of people make decisions together? It could depend a lot on what the use case is, what kind of analogy you want to draw. But I think for me, obviously coming from political science, I'm most interested in the use cases where this group of people needs to make a bunch of complex and strategic decisions, not all of which are, super contained and can be captured directly in the code. And for some use cases, those can get quite complex. For others, it's very simple, and it's not much more than a group chat and a bank account. But for many, and especially some of the most interesting use cases we're seeing now, it's quite a lot more than that. And so once you're in that world, I think I start to think of it as a democracy. That's certainly, I think, where the ethos has gone. But there's lots of practical questions. Democracy is a really wide space. It can capture anything from what we call town hall democracy, when a small group of people get together and talk and come to arrive at decisions by simple consensus, to huge nation state democracy, where you have mass campaigns and political parties and separation of powers, and all different kinds of voting. And so I think, to me at least, this is certainly not the only analogy for DAOs and for blockchain governance, but the ones that are most interesting to me are about what tools can you bring from real world democracies to help these groups of people make effective decisions together. And once you start to think about it like that, you see a lot of room for improvement, because I think the baseline view that we can run everything through direct democracy and have everyone in the DAO vote on everything, we know from several thousand years of history that just doesn't work. And so what kind of representative democracy do you want to build? I think that's the interesting question that comes out of thinking about these analogies.
And I'm curious about how you as a political scientist see the space here as political as opposed to, for instance, economic, right? One of the major kind of design discourses for these spaces, for the systems that they inhabit, for the design of smart contracts, is this idea of cryptoeconomics, this integration of cryptographic computer systems and then economic incentives. And, politics is sometimes presented as the thing you want to escape in your cryptoeconomic designs, in preventing the kind of mess of politics through frictionless coordination. So how does this kind of space differ from, for instance, studying a context that claims to be kind of unapologetically political, like a legislature that might have lots of economics going on in it, but the economics is kind of suppressed and below the surface, even if it's very powerful. Whereas maybe in these DAO spaces, it's kind of the reverse. The claim is, oh, we're just doing economics, not politics, where the human politics kind of lurks beneath the surface. How does this compare to studying the legislature?
Yeah, let me say a couple of things about that. It's super interesting. I think there's a very straightforward way in which they're identical. And that's because some of the most important parts of politics are about who gets what. And if you think about the rise of democratic governance over time, it's deeply intertwined with the rise of taxation and with the rise of the creation of public goods through government and the need to decide who gets what. And that's very, very similar to what goes on in DAOs, but also in lots of other kinds of human organizations, where one, not the only, but one really important set of questions is, what kind of decisions should we make about how to allocate our resources? And when you look at DAO governance, I think that's one of the biggest sources of interesting governance conflicts, is over what to do with this treasury, especially for DAOs that have made a bunch of money and now need to decide, like, should we expand? Should we do more with this stuff? Should we distribute it out to token holders and so forth? And so in that way, it's identical. And DAOs that have reached that scale face precisely the same governance problems that legislatures face. So what have we said about legislatures forever? Well, they spend, quote unquote, too much. Every representative wants to bring home extra resources for their pet projects. And no, it's not really in anyone's interest to cut back the budget. And we see that precisely going on in large DAOs with big treasuries, is concerns that the decentralized nature of the DAO is kind of leading to unnecessarily bloated budgets and so forth. So that's sort of like a very straightforward analogy. There are some important ways, though, that it's also different. The direct economic incentives inherent in holding tokens makes it quite a bit like shareholder governance in a corporation. And that has some interesting differences from a legislature, but the fact that DAO governance decisions are so much less bounded than the set of decisions shareholders get to vote on in a corporation, I think brings it back closer to a democracy. And then you have this really interesting question, which is, one thing people think is different about DAO governance is that because individuals hold these tokens that give them both some kind of nebulous claim over future profits, but also voting rights, that we should see sort of like deeper participation than we see in democracies. And I think that idea, it's really interesting, and where people have gone a little bit further with the tokenomics and started actually incentivizing people directly to participate, I think there we start to see real differences from democracy. But at baseline, it's just not that different, I think, and for a couple of reasons. One is that your individual economic incentive doesn't actually, in any rational perspective, make it give you any incentive to vote. You're just one voter among many. No matter how large your economic incentives are, you can't unilaterally decide this vote unless, of course, you're like a majority, hold a majority of the tokens or something. And so we have a long tradition of figuring out that actually economic incentives aren't that important for participation, because you still have this is in political science called the paradox of voting, which is that it's still irrational for you to vote, even if your incentives to care about the outcome are very strong, because you're just one voter among many. And so just tying in economic incentives, there's no reason to think that should lead to higher participation. And indeed, DAO governance participation is significantly lower in most DAOs than in most democracies in the physical world. And so it doesn't strike me as deeply unique that people are holding economic incentives at the same time that they're holding voting power in DAOs. What is really unique, and I think is where all the exciting opportunities are, is that you can further tailor the way that the voting works, and you can give people these direct incentives to vote. You can reward them for delegating. Those sort of go way beyond what's possible in the technology of physical world voting. That's where I think you start to see more opportunities to innovate.
Well, when I hear my DAO leader friends complaining about low voter turnout, I assure them this is something that is very familiar, for instance, in large co-ops. And that's why when our rural electric co-ops here in Colorado have an annual meeting, they bring out a lot of good food and a guy in a robot suit. And you have to do these sorts of things to encourage participation for a lot of reasons you've highlighted. Primavera, I want to bring another concept into this conversation that you've been working on a lot lately that crosses these lines of old and new worlds, and that's legitimacy. Can you break down a bit what legitimacy means in this context? Because we might think that legitimacy might be something we no longer have to worry about because it is because it's now taken care of by the machines. We don't need to just imagine that somebody has power or that a system works because the machine makes it, proves that it works. It's automated. It's taken care of now. What does legitimacy mean in a context made up of smart contracts?
It's like a $2 million question. So yeah, I mean, it's a very challenging question because the whole notion of legitimacy is extremely complex. But the general understanding or the general use that we have of the terminology is when there is one authority that has been assigned or has been somehow accepted as an authority of power. And then the question is this a legitimate source of power? Is it recognized as having acquired this power legitimately, and is it exercising it legitimately? Now, of course, when we enter into the centralized blockchain DAO space, this authority, at least in theory, is disappeared. We don't have the centralized authority that we have on other online platforms or governmental settings. And so the question is like, does it still make sense to talk about legitimacy, and what are we talking about when we're talking about legitimacy? And interestingly, well, first of all, this authority of power is still there. It's just no longer an institution, but it's a piece of code. It's a protocol. It's a technical system, which is given authority over a specific action. And again, this needs to be questioned whether the way in which that system has been given authority and the way in which the authority is being exercised via that system is legitimate. And then there is another level of legitimacy that comes into play that I think is very interesting and specific to the blockchain, even though it can also be found in other type of like polycentric governance structure, which is the fact that when you have a very easy mechanism of exit, not only exit in terms of like leaving the system, but like exit and reproducing immediately the same system by doing a cut and paste or a fork, then the question of legitimacy comes back in a different manner, where the question is not can we justify this assignment and exercise of power by a particular entity, but it's more about, is the current system as it is done and as it is governed in a centralized or decentralized manner, is it considered legitimate? Because if it is no longer considered legitimate, then it's so easy to leave. And it's so easy to leave and replicate just another system, which change a few features that will be regarded as more legitimate. And so all of a sudden, while the reason that centralized power needs to ensure to be legitimate is so that people are not revolting against it. In the context of a decentralized blockchain-based system, the importance of legitimacy is that people then continue to interact and to engage with that system, as opposed to leaving it for another system, or as opposed to reproducing a similar copy, like a similar mechanism from it. And this is like a very different typology that is much less, there is much less research about this type of legitimacy because it's less commonly found. And so there is a lot of mechanism about how do we ensure the legitimacy of those centralized systems with like separation of power, transparency, due process, and so forth. There is much less information and insights about how do we actually ensure legitimacy in the context of such a decentralized system that are the blockchain and that are the DAOs. And the important issue here is really like how do we make sure that people that are interacting in the system, they feel that they have a say. And again, of course, having a more democratic governance structure might contribute to that, but that's also not enough because even though there is like people can participate, they don't necessarily participate with the same weight, and so there is many attempts at actually creating system that needs to be legitimate, and in some way like legitimacy becomes even more important in a decentralized settings that it will be in a centralized settings.
Great, thank you. Now to break down these concepts a bit more, legitimacy, democracy, I'd love to ask you both to tell a little story of an example DAO that you've interacted with or studied, some place where you've seen these concepts in the wild, to help us understand a bit about how they might manifest in practice and what the consequences of exploring these concepts might be. So you know, is there a story that comes to mind, you know, either of you, that can help us illustrate the concepts you're breaking down for us?
I can go if you want.
Sure.
So yeah, I think there is one DAO that actually I've been looking a lot lately, mostly because of the work I'm doing with legitimacy and constitutionality, constitutionalism within DAOs, and it's the One Hive DAO, which is particularly interesting, and this brings us back to the question of like when we're talking about governance in a DAO, we cannot just look at what is being codified on chain, what are the actual governance structure, because there is all the political stuff, which is the deliberation, which is the initial assignment of power and all those things. So we need to think about the governance of a DAO by including both the on-chain and the off-chain governance of the DAO. And then from like a constitutionalist perspective, then we have like basically this distinction that happens between the formal constitution, which is what has been really written on paper, and in most cases in the DAO, it is the actual code of the smart contract. And then there is the material constitution, which is what actually happens in practice, what are the rules that are actually being enforced. And of course, there is a very strong entrenchment between the formal and the material constitution when we're thinking only on-chain. But as soon as we add the off-chain space, then the entrenchment breaks, because there's a lot of things that are happening off-chain that cannot be represented on the formal constitution of the DAO. And so what's very interesting with One Hive is that they have this notion of a covenant, where the members of the DAO, when they join the DAO, and the covenant is actually written in natural language and is incorporated by reference into the code of the DAO. And so when people join the DAO, they agree to this covenant. And this covenant is like a series of rules and principles that they consider is the legitimate way of operating this DAO. And then they added like a dispute resolution system for when there are issues between the DAO members. And the dispute resolution system is due to resolve the issue, not just by looking at the code of the smart contract in order to understand what was the intention, but actually in light of the covenants that all the members have agreed upon. And it's very interesting because this is actually this is a very interesting example of trying to formalize the off-chain governance structure into a formal document. And so all of a sudden the entrenchment between the formal and the material constitution become much closer also in the context of a DAO. And it's creating this hybrid system in which we have, of course, everything administratively is done on chain, but all the actions and all the voting that is done on chain can be actioned, can be appealed if it is considered to infringe upon the off-chain constitution that is the covenant that I have agreed to. And this is very interesting. This is not the only one. Of course, there is other DAOs that also have experimenting with that, but it's I think it's quite an innovative approach to integrating on-chain and off-chain by recognizing the existence and almost the necessity of off-chain governance rules that becomes part of the material constitution and formalizing them so that they can be better integrated with the on-chain governance.
Great, thank you. And I see a discussion in the chat, for instance, about DAO tooling systems that allow people to build DAOs. And that one Hive example Primavera just described actually has been building a system called Gardens that's designed for others to replicate this same model. So you can actually probe what it's like to try to create a system with this integration of a constitutional, plain text constitutional covenant and this court system. Andy, do you have an example in mind?
Sure. Yeah. I'll keep this brief. I think that I kind of think about two layers of legitimacy. One is sort of thin and one is a much broader, thicker definition of legitimacy. So like the narrow definition, I think, comes back to this idea people sometimes talk about of sort of like governance alpha, this idea that like people want to join and be involved in projects that are more democratically governed or that are more decentralized. And it's a thin definition of legitimacy because it's the broader definition I think about, which is where things like concerns about Meta or Twitter become really relevant, is that an organization is so large that it's making unilateral decisions that affect society in a really meaningful way. And the people who are being affected by the decision aren't necessarily being incorporated properly into the decision-making process. And the people making the decisions don't necessarily have their incentives aligned with the society that is being affected by the decisions they're making. That's like, I think the broad definition of legitimacy I think about in this space. I don't think any DAOs have really reached the scale for that second, thicker definition to matter yet. So let me just say something on the narrower definition. I mean, I think there's this super interesting competition going on to be the most compellingly decentralized, and at least to be able to appeal to this ideology of democratization. I think for a number of reasons. One, because people genuinely believe in it, they're excited about it. Also, two, because it helps to recruit both people who want to contribute to the community as well as people who want to use whatever the service it is that you're creating. And I would just say, like, one, you could pick so many different examples of this, but I think one that's just interesting that I've spent a lot of time studying and hanging out with has been MakerDAO. And MakerDAO is just an interesting example because it's been around for quite a while. By the standards of blockchain, it's been around forever. It's large, it controls quite a lot of money, and it has sort of become increasingly decentralized over time to the point that they've even dissolved the foundation and sort of tried to move to a more truly decentralized model. And that has, I think, over time attracted quite a few really high quality contributors to the community because people really like the sense in which it's truly decentralized. I think Maker is also a good example to think about this broader definition of legitimacy, is that if Maker really became like the world's central bank, then you'd have really serious questions about the legitimacy of the process by which Maker, sets its risk parameters and stuff like that. And you'd need to kind of to some of Primavera's points, it wouldn't be enough to just say like, well, it's decentralized and people get to vote on it. You'd have to do a lot of work to make sure that all of the right stakeholders in the entire sort of like global economy are included in the process in correct ways. Of course, it's not that close to being at that scale. The last thing I would say is just where I've spent a lot of time thinking about this stuff through my work in tech and Web 2 is the social media platforms. And I think one of the most interesting questions that's already obviously been burning for a long time, but with the recent Twitter stuff is even more, current and pressing now, is sort of like, can you bring some level of democratic governance to these social media platforms, because it seems like they're making decisions that affect the flow of information in a way that we think is only sort of properly legitimate for some kind of democratic government to try to make. And I think that, so far it's just the network effects have made it impossible to build a Web3 social media platform that attracts user adoption at the rate that the huge platforms do. And so one of the things I'm interested in is like, are there ways to bring some of these Web3 tools to the Web2 platforms to try to improve the legitimacy of those decisions? So those are just some thoughts I had.
You're reminding me of this old blockchain Twitter clone called Twister that took like an hour to download all the tweets because they were all on the blockchain. This was like 7 years ago or something. Really interesting challenge to create those kinds of network effects. I want to start turning the conversation over to questions because we're getting a lot of good ones, and try to weave them into the conversation we've been having so far. So earlier on, Andy, you talked about one important difference being the kind of programmability of these voting systems, right? When Lani Guinier proposed years ago to change some voting systems and how our legislatures are selected, it was declared undemocratic and un-American when she was nominated by Bill Clinton to be to join the Justice Department, and she was banished from the possibility. But this is a space where there's a lot of creativity, where that kind of reprogramming of how a voting system works is actually kind of par for the course. There have been some questions here about, for instance, liquid democracy, this idea of delegative voting systems. There was also a note in the chat about quadratic voting. How did these, we can get into some of the meanings of these, but also I'd love to hear your thoughts on how these kind of emerging mechanisms and the experimentation with mechanisms might also, for the context of One Hive, consider the mechanism they use for proposal voting, which is called conviction voting. How does the changing of the mechanism actually affect the meaning of these bigger concepts like legitimacy and democracy?
Oh, I'm glad this came up, because this is like probably the thing that most drew me into this space and that I'm most excited about. Is sort of, I've spent my life studying how you build sets of rules, institutions as we call them, to make democracies function better instead of worse. And it's a super exciting and important area to study, and I have no regrets dedicating my life to it. But a real challenge to it is that we don't get to change those systems in the physical world very often. And so for someone like me, I'm very data driven. So my work is about, we take mathematical theories of how voting works or how representation works, and then we bring them to data. And so we collect large scale data sets, and we try to leverage situations and contexts where institutions have been changed, and then measure how much that changes outcomes. How much more do people participate? How much better are our policies that are set in the legislature, and so forth. And a real limitation is just that there's not that many natural experiments out there. If you look, for example, at the US, it's just incredibly hard to change almost anything in the system. And so that's just a real limitation. And so then I discovered this DAO world, where you have this incredible, sometimes analogy I really like is to this sort of petri dish or laboratory, where there's lots and lots of DAOs. There's more and more being created every day. And each one of them is super rapidly experimenting with different ways of setting up all these institutional details that are sort of like isomorphic to these democratic institutions in the real world, except they can be changed super rapidly and you get feedback on them super rapidly, and all the information about what they've done and what happens after they implement it is all publicly available through the blockchain. And so just from a learning perspective, I think it's a once in a lifetime intellectual opportunity to understand what's going on. Some of the most interesting, by no means the only set of levers, but some of the most interesting are these levers about how you design the voting system that you're referring to. So liquid democracy, quadratic voting, futarchy, whatever you want to lay out, there's a ton of interesting design choices that can be made there. And let me make some general and comments rather than too specific on any one of them. But I think the biggest for me open question in this space is what kinds of tweaks to these voting systems are uniquely made possible by blockchain, by Web3, by blockchain governance ideas, and which of those lead to something genuinely better than we can do with sort of like legacy voting. And I think just a few things we know from our experience in the physical world is just tweaking the rules by which people's votes are aggregated or counted or translated into decisions can certainly matter. On the other hand, we tend to think that their consequences are more limited because they run up against these behavioral constraints that basically, like, if the margin on which things really change is getting more people to participate, changing these rules typically doesn't lead a lot more new people to participate than before. And so if that's a really hard constraint in the system, there's other kinds of rules that often have more of an impact than, say, changing to ranked choice voting or something like that, where we think the impact is typically quite limited. The second thing that's closely related is that we tend to think where real change occurs, because these are, I'm thinking mostly of representative democracies here, since that's what we see in the physical world, and that's clearly where DAOs are headed, is that you have to change both the voting rules and also the incentives that these delegates or these representatives have. And this is where, let me just give like an example of liquid democracy. So liquid democracy, just to define it for people if you're not familiar with it, people use it to mean slightly different things, but basically it's this idea that you as a token holder can delegate your voting rights to any other token holder in the system. And then that person gets to vote their voting power and your voting power. And they could even delegate to someone else. There could be like this sort of like chain of people delegating. And so you end up with some set of people who are voting on behalf of other people. And what people like about liquid democracy, as opposed to, say, voting in US elections, let's say, is that it's very continuous. Like, so my representative or my delegate does something today that I don't agree with, I can immediately revoke my tokens, delegate them to someone else. And so we think it could lead to like a much more finer grained notion of accountability, in the sense that you've delegated your tokens to me, and now every day I need to be thinking about whether I'm going to keep having your tokens delegated to me or whether I'm going to lose them. Whereas if I'm a senator in the US, if it's 5 years from my election, I'm not worrying that much right now. Maybe I'm worrying a little bit, not much. And so it could be that a system like that massively changes outcomes, because it could be that it makes delegates do a much better job. It could even increase participation. There's a lot of like open possibilities. I will just say at baseline, what I've observed with it so far is it still faces all the same boring but super important challenges that every other voting system faces. And that is, it's been hard. DAOs are having trouble getting people to delegate. Like, even the choice to delegate your tokens takes some cognitive work and some time. And a lot of people aren't paying attention and don't delegate. If they do delegate, it tends to be lumpy. Like, one person gets delegated a lot, but not very many other people get delegated to. And that's actually could be worse than not having liquid democracy. And so there's a lot of like behavioral questions. And so I think we're in like the first inning in terms of figuring out how to take a technology like liquid democracy and make it work really effectively in practice. But I think the promise of something like that is really exciting. Quadratic voting, I won't get into details because I don't want to take too much time, but similarly, I think super interesting technology, but can we get people to actually behave in a way that's consistent with the assumptions of it? I'm not sure.
Primavera, do you want to take this on?
Yeah, maybe I'm just adding a few things. I'm just gonna, because all the good things have been said, I'm just gonna use the little skeptic spice here. And actually, like Andrew, I was drawn by the DAO world pretty much for the same reason, because like I feel that there is so little space for experimentation in the real world, and this is like such a great space of experimentation. I have to say that looking at the current outcome of experimentation, it is a little bit disappointing in the sense that I will say that the majority of what we call DAOs are actually centralized, multi-sig, that are controlled by a few actors and that are just like allegedly supposed to listen to the decision of the people. And then I think there is a stronger problem, which is who are the people? Because I think all those experiments, at least if we talk about experiments in democracy, they entail the fact that we know we know that there is one person, one vote. We know who are the actual actors that are participating, and because of the design, because of the actually specific design of blockchain technology and the focus toward pseudonymity, then it's actually extremely difficult to experiment with those type of more democratic types of governance structure, and we end up either with like those multi-sig, which are actually controlled by very well-defined people, or some kind of highly plutocratic system where we don't really know who owns the token. We just know that someone has many tokens, and maybe someone has many accounts with a few tokens. So there is of course a little bit of experimentation that is happening with like meritocracy and using reputation in order to somehow counteract the dynamics, the plutocratic dynamics of token-based voting. But I think like the experimentation actually has led to some things, but the things that it has led to are like prediction markets and like futurarchy and all those things that are actually innovative completely and extremely interesting, but that are based on these building blocks that is pseudonymity, and therefore cannot actually achieve the same prerogative that we have in a more traditional democratic-like type of governance structure. So again, and I'm saying this like because I think this is like such a strange setting in which there's so much opportunity for experimentation, but actually most of the experimentation is going in one single direction. And of course, the problem is because we don't have an established and so far considered legitimate identification system that is not either centralized or that is not impinging on the privacy of people. So I'm saying this because, I pat myself back because I think there is like interesting experiment with like this kind of hybrid system with like DAO stack using reputation and prediction market, or like the new governance model of optimism with like the two-chamber system. So there is clearly some experimentation, but all those systems are based on the fact that we need to work with pseudonymous entities, and so it's either plutocracy or meritocracy or some kind of hybridization of those, or it's a multi-sig. So yeah, just my 2 cents.
Great, and that speaks to some questions here about this risk of plutocratic degeneration in the long run, right? And this fear that, okay, these systems are going to be controlled by a handful of whales who are going to accumulate resources and make more whales. There's also this sense that as you were talking about the personhood pieces here, do we just need to be able to replicate some of those features of offline democracy in these online spaces, or do you think there is something that we're seeing kind of beginning to get unlocked here that you think can like do democracy better than we've been able to do democracy offline? Is there one thing or maybe two that you're really looking at that you think opens the door, opens a new door that we need to open right now? And this might also touch on a question here that was raised about this network state concept. This idea that we're seeing a kind of emerging replacement for at least some of the functions of territorial nation states through these kinds of networked entities. Is there something that you think these kinds of entities on blockchains with more decentralized identity systems might do better than what's come before?
Happy to take a very quick stab at that in the last. I mean, I think that hopes of directly porting technology over to kind of like physical world elections, I think is not. I'm not optimistic about that for a variety of reasons. But I think what you just said is the part that interests me. Is like there's just a lot of scope for things and decisions that we might think governments could do, but for whatever reason they choose not to do, either because they're slow to adapt to new technology or because they don't want to do them or they're gridlocked and they're incapable of doing them. And opening up the space at a global level to create communities of people that aren't bound by geography or various forms of red tape to get together and do things together, I think, and generate public goods for themselves and for other people. There might just be a lot of domains where we think government's not doing a very good job today, where that like opening up that space and even just creating that volatility could be good. So I just think, what are the challenges right now in society? I think there's a lot, but obviously cost of education, cost of healthcare, cost of living are across a lot of parts of the world, like huge challenges right now. And so maybe those are spaces where rather than taking blockchain technology and trying to redo the American Constitution, which is, I think, never going to happen, maybe there are global communities built on the blockchain that provide some new ideas and services in those types of areas. I mean, that would be interesting.
Last thought, Primavera?
Yeah, yes. So I think there's a lot of things that DAOs can contribute to, provided that we have a proper governance structure, and that might require a proper identity system. But I think the thing that I'm looking at actually, that might make me like kind of a weirdo, is like I'm actually looking at how blockchain technology can be adopted within existing institutions in order to improve their governance. And that means like, whether those are like public or private institutions, adopting blockchain technology within their own information systems in order to increase transparency, in order to increase accountability, in order to actually create better governance structures that are more automated and so forth. So I think there is a lot, without even trying to create like a whole new system, I think just injecting some blockchain features into our existing institution to try to kind of like help them transition into a better model. I think already that is like really good if we can do it. And then of course, I think there is like a lot of innovation that can be done via the blockchain. And I think, again, one I think is actually experimentation and trying to see what comes out of those things. And then I think it's more like all those possibility of creating initiatives that are more community governed at the outset. And just in general, like being able to coordinate and collect actually funds of people that want to do something together and create those communal or cooperative-like endeavor that can complement, at least. I wouldn't say that they can replace any of the prerogative of the nation state, but they can clearly complement a lot of things and at least provide choices and alternatives so that people can pick or maybe even enjoy both of them. So for me, like I really see them as like something that can help and support existing institution rather than something that is intended to just like replace them or supplant them.
Thank you both so much. Sorry to run over a bit on time, but we're on time to for the next session. Thank you all. Really great discussion. Looking forward to what's to come.